I was just mentioning to somebody that I was going to shoot Barry for putting me last, especially after Karen's great talk. I'm actually really kind of redirecting things a little bit here in my talk. I have to put that down because this isn't a flat podium. Today we've heard a number of different responses to the observations that James Elkins makes in his book on the strange place of religion in contemporary art. Dan Seidel has outlined possible links or correspondences that can be found between the practice and experience of art and religion. Christina Valentine has raised the significance of content and context for our understanding and poses key questions. What is art? Why make it? How is it done? Karen Kleinfelder has introduced the critical issue of where the human being is in our contemporary world, not just in contemporary art, but in our contemporary world. And with all of those things, even though each presentation has been very different from the others, there have been certain strains that have kept re-emerging, and I hope that you have heard them. And so in my presentation, what I'm actually doing is returning to where this symposium began last evening. Some of you were there, with the question of vocation and the artist of faith. What does this really mean for the artist of faith? What is the role of art in our world today? How do artists perceive their calling in the arenas within which they may aspire to work? And are artists of faith relegated to work outside of the art world, as James Elkins describes in his book? Over the last 6 to 12 months, I've been giving a great deal of thought to the question of the vocation of art itself, and of the Christian artist in particular. And the fact that even the use of the designation Christian artist instead of artist of faith causes many backs to rise up in fear of being pigeonholed or pigeonholing someone else is really telling of the climate in which we find ourselves. And that climate is not just what we often refer to as the secular world, but also the Christian world, the Christian subculture, where those kinds of questions and terms are fraught with great weight and baggage. It seems to me that the vocation of the Christian artist, or the artist of faith, encompasses a vast range of possibility. But in grappling with the state of the contemporary art world as described by Dr. Elkins, it has also become clear to me that it is necessary for the artist who is a Christian to understand just what it means to live as a Christian in this world. And that requires a recognition that we live in a state of tension in this life. But a tension with what, or between what? These are essential questions. In the opening of Genesis, human beings are given stewardship of this world, to look after it, to nurture it, and to prosper in it. This is a creational perspective that identifies what human beings were made for. But this is only one piece of the picture of the circumstances in which human beings find themselves. In the book of Hebrews, the life of the Christian is described as that of a sojourner. That is, one who is on a journey to somewhere else and here only as a temporary resident. The world in which the Christian now finds himself is not unlike that of the early Christian church, where the dominant worldview, beliefs, values, and institutions stand in sometimes stark contrast with those of Christians. In a postmodern, post-Christian, and what is increasingly being described as a post-human age, where the systems and technologies within which human beings must operate take primacy over consideration of the human being itself. reference Kieran's talk, Christians are now situated in a context surprisingly like that of the ancient pagan world, where a multiplicity of belief systems competed for people's allegiance. So what do we make of this dual description of the Christian as, on the one hand, a steward, and on the other, a sojourner? Both we are to understand as being true. The reality is that the Christian lives betwixt and between the two, with the responsibilities of being a full citizen of this world, while understanding that his ultimate allegiance is to another. The Christian is, in fact, like a member of the diaspora, and we heard Christina referring to some of those multiple identities that so many of us are living with today. One who lives between two worlds and two identities. The Christian then lives between these two identities, steward and sojourner, called to invest himself fully in the here and now of this world without being vested in it. What's the difference? To be vested in something is to tie one's future and well-being to it. And that is something that the Christian is cautioned against doing. Hebrews challenges Christians to understand that the so-called city, as it's referred to, in which they now reside, is currently under the administration of another authority that operates by different rules and values, and that they may be required to go and work outside the gates, as it were, of that city. The early Christians were not just outcasts, but they were quite literally outlaws, according to the authorities governing the world in which they lived. This, I think, is useful to remember. While Christians may not be outlaws in the world in which most of us here live today, although in some parts of the world they are, they do at times stand in contrast and sometimes in conflict with the institutions of the societies in which they live and work. Understanding this, it should not surprise Christian artists today to often find themselves relegated to working outside of the centers of contemporary art, regardless of the type of work they produce. It's okay to laugh. This painting by Cliff Davis, titled The Conformist, drawing on Warner Salmon's well-known rendering of Christ, reminds us in a startling way that Christ himself did not conform to the expectations of the world in which he found himself. But what does that mean for the work Christians are to do in the matter in which they undertake it? This does not mean that they should be throwing bombs and shouting epithets at the authorities or at their detractors, metaphorically speaking. Nor does it mean that they are to turn tail and run for cover, ensconcing themselves within the safe haven of a Christian subculture. It does mean that they are to attempt to involve themselves in this arena at whatever level is possible, to engage others authentically and to challenge those things that need to be challenged. In other words, while they are to contribute and care deeply for the world in which they find themselves, they should not seek to find their identity and worth in it. This is actually a tremendously freeing concept and needs to be recognized as such. This tension with the world in which the Christian artist finds himself is brought into sharp focus by Dr. Elkins' book. Elkins tells us that there is simply no place for sincere religious belief in the contemporary art world, and that when the two are brought together, they wreck each other. We've heard reference to that in earlier presentations. Each undermines the power and the value of the other. It's not that religion has no value, according to Dr. Elkins, but that it is something else that needs to be kept separate. It's important to understand how Dr. Elkins defines the contemporary art world that he's describing. It encompasses a select group of art schools, galleries, and museums, and corresponding critical periodicals and voices that determine what is currently considered important contemporary art within the contemporary art world. Oddly, this world that he describes conjures up images of the academies of the past that set standards for both form and content and its treatment, determining what was acceptable and what was not, and which artists would receive its patronage. They determined what real art was. Ironically, many of the artists sanctioned by those academies and their works have not endured the test of time. While they may have been prominent and successful in their own age, many have been forgotten, and it is artists who were working outside those hallowed halls, moving in other directions, aspiring to other objectives for their art, that have endured and are seen as the true figures who link one age and development to another. I raise this simply because, from a historical perspective, one has to wonder whether this might not be the case today, at least to a degree. And distance may be necessary before we really understand what's happening in our own time. In a sense, what we seem to find in the contemporary art world as described in Elkin's book is an establishment with its own orthodoxy. Postmodernism is contemporary art, to rephrase Elkins. It requires adherence to a doctrine of, quote, complexity, ambiguity, difficulty, the absence of religion, and lack of sentiment for participation and membership. Strangely, persons of faith understand that living by faith, by its very nature, encompasses complexity, ambiguity, difficulty, doubt, and paradox. One must live with a profound sense of the limits of what one can know or understand fully at any given point in time. The Apostle Paul refers to this present condition in which Christians find themselves as, quote, seeing through a glass darkly. It requires both faith and humility of the Christian as he makes claims to the fullness or finality of his understanding and perceptions. But Elkin's analysis raises another issue, and that is the issue of historicism, or the lack thereof in many of the assessments of society, culture, and art currently being made that are presented as if they are absolute and final. What I mean is that many critics, and ironically many historians, frequently seem to be frozen in their own moment, and perhaps understandably so. That's where we live. Instead of taking the longer view of the lessons we learn from history, which shows that the world and culture is in a constant state of movement and change, we are presented with a view that seems to suggest at times that we have arrived at some ultimate value and rightness of understanding in our own time. History has demonstrated time and time again that the standards and ideas of one age will be challenged and either moderated or overturned in the next. Why would our own age be any different? In his lectures on aesthetics, the philosopher George Hegel describes man as, quote, an amphibious animal because he now has to live in two worlds which contradict one another. Hegel's identification of living between two worlds as the fundamental aspect of the human condition merely recognizes what Christians already understand. In The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis writes, "For they," referring to art and beauty, "are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have never yet visited." In other words, art has the capacity to point us toward that for which we are made, but are not yet able to attain. This is not at all a new perception. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus observed back in the 5th century BC that, quote, man is estranged from that with which he is most familiar, and he must continuously seek to discover it. This estrangement is actually what Dr. Elkin's earlier book, titled Pictures and Tears, reveals, when he explores the experience many people have had of being unexpectedly and inexplicably overwhelmed before a work of art, even to the point of tears. The common thread that ties so many of these accounts together when you read his book is a consciousness of what the writers often dub as beauty, for want of a better word, often by works that can be by no means considered conventionally beautiful. This is experienced as a longing for something they can't quite reach, can't quite name, can't quite define. Ironically, this is actually a phenomenon that from a Christian framework is fairly easily explained, where the human being lives between the two states of that for which he was made and the limitations of the reality in which he finds himself, and has some sense of that disjunction. We have heard that art may have reached an end, either a telos, which means its fullness, or a terminus, its limits, an end of some sort. The debate raging over the last decade or so concerning the end of art and what comes after the end of art makes the consideration of the ends of art all the more critical, in my view. Considering the question, what is art for, seems even more compelling when confronted with the perceptions of the contemporary art world as they are described by Dr. Elkins. I would like to suggest that play is a useful concept in understanding at least one key aspect of the ends and the means of art. When we say something has play in it, we refer to an elasticity, a capacity to be stretched, pushed, and pulled that will reveal the true nature of the thing. A child's play is an essential process of learning about himself and his world. It takes delving deep inside oneself in order to project and connect with that which is outside. Anyone who observes a child's play notices the intensity of immersion that is involved. Social historian Johannes Huizinga, in his book Homo Ludens, a study of the play element in culture, describes play as essential to human being. The term Homo ludens is in fact Latin for mankind as the species of play. According to Huizinga, to play is, quote, to dare, to take risks, to bear uncertainty, to endure tension. These are the essence of the play spirit, end quote. It is in fact the spirit of relentless discovery and probing invention that requires such courageous exploration. Philosopher Rollo May defines creativity as the process of bringing something new into being through the intense encounter of a person with his or her world, as subjective as that might be. He is, in essence, describing the immersive engagement that can bring about the light bulb experience, the aha moment of revelation and new understanding. This is the kind of activity that artists undertake, and this is the kind of moment that they can bring about for others through an engagement with their art. C.S. Lewis said that reason is the organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning. Arthur Danto, Columbia University philosopher and art critic, confirms that, quote, art is getting across indefinable but inescapable meaning. The artist's play brings us into significant relationship with things generating meaning, even though that meaning is often fraught with complexity, ambiguity, difficulty, and paradox. Living out the dual roles of steward and sojourner in relationship to this world requires the artist of faith to focus on identifying and pursuing his or her particular calling in art, and letting the issues of recognition and acceptance by the contemporary art world, as it's defined by Dr. Elkins, in his book, to take care of themselves. This releases the artist of faith to pursue his or her art freely and authentically without adhering to false standards set by any authority, Christian or otherwise, about what he or she might do and the manner in which he or she might do it, as long as he or she remains true to his or her faith. I'm reminded of a talk given by artist Bruce Herman some years ago, where he raised this very issue using this emblem: question authority, followed by question autonomy, in order to remind us of the dual truths that human beings must be cautious of the authorities to which we submit ourselves, but also must live in profound relationship to those around us. On the Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art raises important issues and perspectives that are necessary for people of faith to understand if they are to enter into the arena of the arts. But perhaps most importantly, it brings into sharp focus some key questions that need to be considered. What is art for? What is the art? Who is the art for? And how does it contribute to this human enterprise in which we are the key participants? I think each of the presenters today have actually raised those issues in some provocative and profound ways. But perhaps Karen has done that most startlingly, that one of these central issues that all of us have to confront at this point is, what does it mean to be human? And that is at the heart of Christian faith.